All right, everyone, let's go ahead and begin. Good morning. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We have just a couple of announcements before we get started. We will continue to let people in as we see them. First, we are recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you would like to ask our speakers a question during the session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen. You can also engage in the chat by using that window as well. There is a chat window to your right as well. And we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and your cameras off during the presentations and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with the camera and or microphone. So that is all I have. I want to get us started. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Alina.
Hi, folks. Welcome everyone this morning to the second part of a 3-part special session on using high resolution remote sensing for fuels characterization and fire effects. Today's talks this morning, in this morning's session, we'll start with Russ Parsons shortly looking at use of high resolution remote sensing, and then we're going to have a number of examples from different ecosystems across the world of using these tools to improve our understanding of fire and fuels. So I'm going to let Russ take it away and we will get going.
Okay, folks. Hey, Alina and everyone, thanks so much for putting this session together. Anthony, thanks for your excellent management of this. It gives us great confidence and your cheerful energy is very much appreciated. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge my many partners in this work, most of which in this talk are from Montana, and I'm just really grateful to work with all of those folks. Remote sensing plays a really critical role in fire and fuels management. First, as the primary data source behind our national fuels maps in land fire, and then in burn severity mapping, updates to those with MTBS. And in the big picture, the spaceborne MODIS and VIIRS data capture not only changes over time in our ecosystems, but also are really useful in getting the big picture fire progressions. Which has really become critical in the last few years, where in many cases there's dozens and dozens of big fires at the same time, and it's overwhelming to our normal airborne NIROPS operations for getting IR flights done. While many coarser spaceborne imagery sources continue to be really important to fire management, we have increasing access to more diverse and higher resolution data than we've had before. Planet data, for example, is close to the NAIP airborne imagery in its resolution. And between both the higher spatial resolution and the higher temporal resolution of these new data sources, we have just an entirely new set of possibilities in mapping fuels, as well as looking at fuel condition over time. Another critically important high-resolution remote sensing data source is airborne LiDAR scanning, or ALS. Similar to the segmentation and feature extraction approaches that can be done with high-resolution imagery, individual tree detection and tree approximate object approaches enable characterization of forest structure, often with accuracy similar to what we can measure in the field, but over much larger areas. Perhaps the biggest new recent development in high resolution remote sensing, though, is in terrestrial LiDAR scanning, TLS, and unmanned aerial systems, UAS, or drones. These new approaches, for the first time, get us past these big, typically expensive data acquisitions to more affordable local data set collections, usually for smaller areas, but with much higher detail even than ALS. The rapid emergence of ALS, TLS, UAS, and lots of other things ending with S, and many other new data sources and approaches offer new possibilities for fuel mapping. So in this talk, I'm gonna, gosh, does this screen share thing appear for you? I hope not. I'm gonna give a kind of a tour of some recent work. I'm not gonna get into any particular case in great detail, but it's kind of a whirlwind tour of some different applications of this kind of stuff. So first, I'm going to talk about what we're doing in the field, 2 field sites in Oregon and Montana, and then particularly talking about data collection on research prescribed burns with UAS and TLS. Then I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing in the lab, where we've been quantifying fuels with TLS and quantitative structural modeling, and then looking at how we can link those data to advanced fire models. And these efforts really tie into some other related efforts. If you're interested, you can check out my talks later today at 1 p.m. talking about using high resolution data and modeling in firefighter training. And my third talk today at 2:20, describing how high resolution fire data fit into a new prototype 3D fuel system called Fast Fuels. Since 2017, our team has been working with the Nature Conservancy, collecting fuel and fire data on research prescribed burns at the Sican Marsh, a 33,000 acre preserve in South Central Oregon. Working closely with our partners, we have embedded research data collection efforts into management burns with multiple units per year and burning for 3 consecutive years. We had further burns that were planned for 2020 and 2021, but were postponed so far due to COVID-19. But we are planning to pick those back up in June of this coming year. So we use UAS extensively in this effort for pre and post burn fuels, and for also getting detailed observations of fire behavior. UAS data provide very high resolution imagery. So this series of slides here kind of illustrates the difference between what we're used to with standard airborne imagery from NAPE and what we get with the UAS. So in this case, you're looking at a typical 1 meter resolution NAPE imagery. And if you zoom in, you can certainly see individual trees, but you also see that their shadows get confused with them. Now, if you zoom into the same area in the 4 centimeter resolution UAS, you can see that there's exquisite detail that we get from that. Zooming in further, you can see individual small shrubs, individual pieces of coarse woody debris. And when you're using UAS, you typically take a whole series of images, and these can be stitched together with a process called structure from motion. And essentially you reconstruct a 3D point cloud of that area. This is, you can see it's relatively low density forest out there, but the multiple perspectives that we get from the drone enable us to look under the trees. In some case, for example, seeing the actual stems. So this is, this data acquisition was for about a little bit over 4 acres, and it took less than an hour with a drone. So that is, you think about how much time it would take to measure all those trees and get all those measurements. It's an extraordinary amount of data that you get out of that. Okay, moving on here. The ability to hover enables UAS to provide unparalleled perspective on fire experiments. In our 2018 burns, we had 8 drone plots. As an example, we're going to focus on this drone plot H. So this area had a stringer of ponderosa pine forest, some scabby sage, and then a decent patch of cheatgrass in here, which shows up as this kind of white or gray area. Zooming in a bit, we can see that a critical aspect of this data collection is that we can link fire behavior and fire effects at really fine scale. So just for reference, here's a couple small trees. And as we look at the thermal imagery passing through there, you can see that we're capturing how that fire burns under those 2 trees. We can look at the time it's there, and we can do all sorts of things to characterize the energy, et cetera. This kind of data provides us with opportunities to look at fire in ways we've never been able to do before. using this data, Chris Moran developed new fire metrics for rate of spread, as well as for developing a statistical process for assessing fuel and fire interactions at the appropriate spatiotemporal scales. So it's just really exciting what this brings for us. Okay. The next set of slides examines our Bandy Ranch site. So this is located here in Montana. It's owned by the University of Montana. And we started burning there in November 2020. And since then, we've had 3 different sets of research burns. In November 2020, we carried out our first burn out there. Oops. Supposed to be a little thing that pops up right here. Focusing on this area right here. Oh, sorry, I got out of sync. Okay, so that's a view from the north. This is more from the east. And you can see that when we did the drone flight, we get this wonderful point cloud, which really captured that scene in 3D in such remarkable detail. So yeah, I got ahead of myself there. In 2020, we focused our first burns on this patch of grass over here, about 2 acres. And this experiment focused on fuel-fire interactions at fine scales, looking at how fire might change as it passes through fuels with different loads or with loads that are modified by treatment. We used the UAS to capture pre, during, and post-burn states. In this figure, the different colors of the circles represent different loads classified from field measurements. And really the simplicity and small size of these within burn plots made it possible for us to replicate experiments within a burn, enabling analysis for both individual burns as plots as well as across them. And I'm not going to get into too much detail on this, but basically what we get from this is an ability to capture the event of the fire as it passes through that spot and looking at the interactions around it that are driven by fire fuel interactions at fine scales. So really the high temporal and spatial resolution of the UAS enables us to examine these interactions in a way that we haven't really been able to do before. So now just looking at another burn from November 2020. This was our first big burn out there, about 108 acres. This is the unit map. Most of it was this forest unit, and then we had some grass over here. And for now, I'm just going to focus on this area here in our forest plot 2. Here's just kind of a zoom in from Google Earth. And here you can see this is a sped up thermal imagery as the fire burns in from the edges. And I think what this really illustrates is the ability to look at the interactions between fire lines and fuels and fire lines and each other in high temporal and spatial resolution. And I think it really opens up new possibilities for looking at fire effects, fire behavior and fire effects interactions. So now just moving into a little bit of tour of some TLS related work. TLS also gives us entirely different ways of looking at fuels. Here you can see the exquisite detail of gridded TLS data collected at our SciCan site by Eric Rowell. The high point density of TLS data facilitates numerous ways of looking at fuels. Voxelization, shown here, can be a path to quantifying fuels in 3D and is an important step in connecting such data to advanced fire models. There are many additional things that can be done with this data. One promising and really interesting approach is to use TLS data to develop quantitative structural models. This can provide us with in-depth views of fuel size class distributions within an individual tree crown and many related metrics important to tree function, health, and structure. High-resolution imagery is also very useful in lab experiments. Here you can see Sharon Hood with one of our small tree burn experiments from this last summer. We used thermal video to capture the trees as they burned, and we collected a whole lot of data in these lab experiments that captured mass loss and other aspects over time. This experiment was interesting in that it had live trees, and we had multiple species and multiple factors. Some trees survived the burns and are being tracked over time in the greenhouse. We also used pre and post burn TLS scans to capture the structure of these fuels before and after the burn. This is just really raw data here. And we collected a lot of data, photos and other data measurements on the trees pre and post as well. One of the things that is really important with this is that this highly resolved data in TLS can be used to develop inputs to advanced fire models. But an important question with this is, how much detail do we need? So these models can be run at very fine detail, but how far down in that fine resolution do we need to go? So we were interested in carrying out a sensitivity analysis to the resolution. So here's the initial point cloud of one of our trees, and here it is with voxelization at different scales going up from that. So here what you see is our team developed algorithms to connect the TLS data scans to physics-based fire models. This animation shows some sensitivity analysis in which the same tree is burned in simulations with different resolutions. So this little tour shows just a few of the almost limitless ways in which high resolution remote sensing is changing wildland fire science. Not only does it provide us with new data and inspire new analysis, but can also serve to remind us of the remarkable complexity and beauty in fire, as you can see in this oblique UAS video from our 2017 Cyclone Marsh burns. Anyhow, that's it for me. I think I'm ready to hand it over to the next person or answer questions.
Thanks, Russ, for your excellent presentation. I am going to open up. We've got a few minutes for questions. So if anyone just wants to turn off their mic and ask, you can go ahead, and I will be checking the question and answer queue online. And if we don't have any questions from the audience, I have one for you. And it's about how you are going to be linking the remote sensing data from TLS with the fire radiative data from the FLIR cameras. Or do you have any plans to?
Well, there's a lot of complicated stuff going on there, but one of the first things that's really critical to this is you need to be able to co-register everything really well. So we use a survey grade base and rover GPS setup that can get down to sub-centimeter accuracy. So that solves one of the critical problems, which is knowing which pixels you're talking about. Okay, and then there's a whole complicated world of extracting energy measurements from imagery, and I would say that we're pursuing several different strategies. We have a couple different partners working on different aspects of it. One of the key things that we want to do in terms of connecting this kind of data to the 3D fire models is calculating the heat release rate per unit area. So that is a really, there's a couple ways you can get there, but I probably don't have time to explain it right now.
No, but that's a great step in the right direction. Russ, we look forward to hearing more from you either in your live talks or recordings afterwards, and we are going to move on to the next speaker, and hopefully we'll capture some more of the discussion.
All right, great. Thanks so much.
Okay, so next up we have Louise Loudermilk. And I'm just going to let her get her presentation up here. And we've got 1 minute before you need to get going, Louise.
All right, thanks, Alina. So I've already got this pre-recorded, so I'm going to let it run.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited.
I'll answer questions.
Okay, and you're on time.
On how we characterize vegetation across a topographic gradient. in a frequently burned Piedmont Forest of central Georgia. As you can see, this is clearly a team effort between me and a lot of different agencies and a lot of different people. And I absolutely want to recognize them because this is a large team effort. So the Piedmont Forests is predominantly an area in that sort of tan region there in the map that's between the coastal plain of the southeastern United States and the Appalachian Mountains. But we're particularly going to focus within Georgia. Here where that red dot or the red star there is the Hitchity Experimental Forest. It's kind of nestled between the Oconee National Forest and also the Piedmont National Wildlife Refuge. There's a significant amount of active prescribed fire programs within the Piedmont region itself. Within the Chattahoochee-Oconee National Forest, they can burn up to 50,000 acres a year. They do this to promote pine dominance and suppress hardwoods. That particularly one big species of interest is sweet gum. And prescribed fire is also used to maintain red-crooked woodpecker habitat and also other game habitat, and there's a considerable amount of timber management that goes on in the area. Now, landscape position really has a big influence on vegetation and fuel characteristics, and in these areas, they're considered kind of rolling hills, right? Because they're on the foothills of the mountains, but not quite to the coastal plain. And so the elevation grading is usually between like 30 to 50 meters difference in elevation between the bottomland hardwoods and the upland pines. And so this is how I'm going to talk about this sort of gradient. Bottomland hardwoods, or I might call them broadleaves. It can be anywhere from sweet gums. There's dozens of species, maples and tulip poplars, and in the upland pines, it's predominantly loblolly pine at the Hitchity, but can also be shortleaf pine, a little bit of longleaf, and in this transition zone, it can be kind of a little bit of both, really. And as well, this elevation change also can influence the moisture along that gradient, and all these together influence fire behavior and fire effects. And so here, this picture is taken within a bottomland where we're looking up. And so first, let's note the understory, where you predominantly just see leaf litter in the bottomlands. And as you move up the hill here, you can actually see a lot more grasses and stems kind of in the understory. And that's that sort of transition area and up into the pinelands. And you can also see a difference in the overstories. It's taken in the winter, so most of the hardwoods are deciduous. And you can also see that same sort of transition, the overstory from the bottomland to the upland pines. And because of this, because of the topography and the vegetation change, there's quite a bit of variability in fire behavior in this one landscape. Sometimes in the bottomland hardwoods, there's often creeks, and the fuel moisture is typically pretty low. So on a day where it's not very dry, sometimes it doesn't even burn into the bottomlands, but it only predominantly burns the leaf litter. And the upland pines, it's typically much more active fire behavior, and it spreads nicely. So here I just wanted to show basically a pre and a post picture. So there's Christie smiling for us. But so there's a couple things we can note here. First of all, that most of the fire effects are in the ground layer, the surface layer. So there's a lot of consumption in the leaf litter and the grasses. And you can still see the stems that are there, but most of them have been top killed. So even though they're not consumed, they are most likely going to die, but most of them resprout. Probably over 90% of it resprouts. You can also see a little bit of scorch in that in the pine sapling there on the top right. Okay, so some just broad goals that we've been thinking about is first to increase fire effects monitoring by using an easy, reliable, and repeatable approach with TLS. Usually it's not used in the same sentence, especially easy. but we'll talk about that today. And we are also doing a quick fire demonstration landscape. And quick fire is a three-dimensional fire behavior model. And here our inputs are airborne laser scanning, terrestrial laser scanning, and field measurements. And both of these need vegetation and fields that are characterized across this topographic gradient. Now the Hitchity experimental forest, here we blocked out a couple different areas to burn, and the one there you can see on the left is outlined on the right with the hash marks. And it was about, maybe a 300 or 400 acre area. And to zoom in a little bit more, you can see here these green dots. So those are actually transect setup where we did all the BLK monitoring, we did the fuels measurements, and they were set up along, you can't see the topography here, but they're actually set up along a topographic gradient, so we can capture that gradient across these different areas. And here, there was ALS flown last January. These burns were last March, but ALS was flown last January, provided by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And from this, we can get a very explicit digital elevation model, as well as a canopy height model of the overstory. And we can use these directly into quickfire with tree heights and locations and crown estimations. Now the TLS, so what we did was we used a terrestrial laser scanner called the Leica BLK. A lot of times we just call it the BLK. It's a lightweight portable push button unit. It's probably about 2 pounds. It's super easy. Literally push a button, you go hide behind a tree, and it does a 360-degree scan in 5 minutes. And so here's an output from one of the scans. And we're working on this approach with a group of people, particularly with the Fish and Wildlife Service and Tall Timbers, to do this tiered sampling approach, where you do a scan and you can do some measurements in the field that are customizable for fire effects monitoring. And this is outlined more in the paper that I have referenced there. So from this, you can get, from these scans, if you crop them out to about a 15-meter radius, you can get a canopy estimation. You can compare those two hemispherical photos of the same plots. You can also get tree metrics, so the number of trees, the DBH of them, the height of them. Here's representation in more of the upland pines where the trees are more distinct. In the mixed pine hardwood areas, there could be up to like 30 trees here, but they're all measured. And so we decided to take a little closer look at this. So this is some work done by Wade Ross from Tall Timbers, where we're beginning to look at the difference between the field measurements that we took of the trees and comparing that to the BLK or the TLS, which is in teal, and the field measurements are in orange. And so really the only thing I want to say here is we've started this analysis to sort of compare these data. And we're finding some occlusion and misclassification, but there's a little bit better representation in the uplands. But we're trying to work out some of these discrepancies, why they might be happening, and we're going to move forward with that. So a little bit closer look at the surface vegetation that we measured. So this is using the 3D sampling method. And here we can see the leaf litter plot. And here's more of a grass and pine needle plot. And here's more when we have some definite stems to measure in our plots, just to give you a representation of what we've measured. Okay, so with the BLK, once you've pulled out those trees, you can start looking at the vegetation within those BLK scans. So we've started to actually pull out the shrubs within the scans, the herbaceous and the leaf litter within the scans, and also using pre and post scans, we can start measuring consumption. And from the field data, so bear with me here, this is just a few minutes on some bar graphs, but here we can see BL is broadleaf, so think about it as like hardwood. So hardwood litter, it's not surprising, this is from our field data. where the hardwood litter decreases as you go up the hill. And on the other hand, pine needles, there's more pine needle mass as you go up the hill. And then, so live stems, okay, so those are, so remember, these are just in these small little sampling plots. So the live stems actually increase in mass as you go up the hill. So this is all captured very nicely with our sampling approach. We also measured fuel moisture. Again, these were 3 different days that we burned, which are represented in those different colors. And here you see a difference in if we measured pine needle fuel moisture in a sunny area versus a shaded area. And first of all, you can see a difference between that and difference between time of day and also difference between days. Oh, and we did use a really interesting microwave method to capture this. And we also measured, so this is the difference between pine needles and oak leaves. And here what we see is the difference in fuel moisture, particularly if you look at hardwoods. The fuel moisture starts out considerably higher than the pine needles, and it takes a lot longer for them to really drop in fuel moisture content, which we can use as stuff we can use directly into QuickFire. Okay, so there's a lot going on this table here, but I really just want to describe that we can see that we can put all kinds of different scales of information into the QuickFire model, whether it be a basic run all the way to a very discrete run. So we wanted something that was very realistic. And so of course, with realism comes complexity. So we focused on, we had the ALS data, we had the TLS, we had RAWS information, we had mapped ignitions, we had fuel moisture from the day. But keep in mind that you can kind of mix and match here a little bit too, where you can have a discrete map of where you are, but then you can incorporate more broad information into your QuickFire run. And I definitely want to mention here that fast fuels can absolutely be incorporated into that second line with vegetation and fuels. That's where the FIA data comes in. And so for our QuickFire simulation, we knew that fuel moisture was going to be higher in those bottomland areas. So that's so you can see that there in the teal area on the right, and then that darker blue is more of the upland area. And within this, we of course incorporated our field data of surface slope density. We actually had ignition lines and ignition rates. So this actually represents our QuickFire simulation. As you can see here, we had mapped ignitions from hand lines and also from a UAS that was dropping ping pongs. So you can see here the fire is moving pretty well up the hill a little bit, and some more lines were put in. So remember, this was burned over 3 or 4 hours. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to move along. So I wanted to show here that the final area that was burned with QuickFire that I just showed you was on the left, and we had that difference in fuel moisture across that gradient. But we also ran a final burned area with different fuel moisture content. That actually should say low fuel moisture content. And here the biggest difference is that you could actually have escapes if your fuel moisture was too low. And so actually the representation on the left is more realistic to what happened because we did not have escapes that day. Okay, so final thoughts is that fine skin variability in vegetation and fuels across topographic gradient is important for simulating fire behavior, for measuring fire behavior and effects. Now, we didn't talk about this today, but there were a lot of measurements done on consumption and mortality and stem heating estimations that we're doing. And TLS is monitoring. Excuse me. Now, TLS monitoring is advancing very, very quickly. the ease of processing, the measurements that are taking, the inventory that's coming out of the TLS products. There's an enormous amount of demonstration sites across the Southeast, and even across the US that are occurring right now. So it's moving pretty quickly. And just some additional info, because this is being recorded, here are some additional talks that you can find on Quickfire and some of the BLK stuff and other references as well. And I just want to say thank you for everybody. And also thank you for everybody with the Hitchity demo. And there's my email up top if you want to contact me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Louise. There are a couple questions, and I'm going to try to navigate multiple windows to read them for you. And just to give a little context, folks, sometimes I'm noticing these questions are showing up under an individual talk, and sometimes they're showing up under the group talks. So we have one question from Kate Wilkins, who asked, how well do these methods capture grass and ground fuels? And that may actually have been a question for Russ now that I'm looking at the timestamp on that. So we'll leave that for later. Are there any general questions from the audience on this particular talk that anyone can turn their mic on and go ahead and ask?
Well, I can try to answer that one a little bit.
Yeah.
Russ can chime in too, but I mean, I showed a little bit of that in my talk there. So the grasses are pretty good and shrubs are pretty good to characterize. I think the tough one is leaf litter. And so, really getting very, so how Russ was talking about like location on where you put the scans. And so the same thing, even when you have a pre and a post scan, where you put your instrument is really important. So because you always have to sort of flatten out your scanned image. And that makes a difference on kind of what, the ground layer is really going to look like. So being very careful about comparing pre and post burn scans to kind of look at leaf litter differences is a tough one, but yeah.
So you're still having to deal with registration of the data, even the data is very high resolution.
Yes.
Okay. And then my question for you is, with transferring this data into Quickfire, how many different ignition scenarios can you test in a realistic time frame?
That's more of a question for the Quickfire folks, but I mean, it runs on a computer, just like on a laptop. So it really depends on kind of how powerful your computer is, but usually within a couple hours or a day, you can get a simulation done. So yeah, I mean, they can incorporate, all kinds of different ignition lines, and even make kind of quick changes to, like if it's one value of fuel moisture, for the whole landscape, I think that's pretty easy, but if you make more explicit changes, kind of like we did, that makes it a little more complex, right?
Okay.
So there's a lot of flexibility in sort of testing different scenarios for sure.
Excellent. And would you be able to post a link to your paper in the community chat for this talk? And that way people can reference that and see that if they like. Are there any other questions from the audience? Let me just double check. Oh, okay, we've got one. How deployable are these methods for a typical fire manager scientist interested in using these methods to measure fire behavior or landscape scale burns?
Okay, so in terms of, we're still talking about the BLK here, right? I think, even though you said fire behavior.
Yeah.
So I kind of just mentioned that a little bit about how we're sort of developing this monitoring protocol, and we're really testing this within the, in the manager realm, because we want it to be easy, we want it to be usable. Russ is a part of this too. We're all sort of working together on how do we make this simple and effective and usable. So there's a big push for that. And yes, I mean, the greatest thing about, and we've actually had people go out that don't know anything about this stuff, and go out and do these measurements, with the BOK and go out there with like the crosshair sampling and that sort of thing. And I think it's proven really, really effective. And we've also put in a couple JFSP proposals and Russ as well to sort of look at this within the actual application realm and in the user realm, not just on the research side of things.
Excellent. Louise, we're going to have to move on to Kathryn Fuller is up next, so she can bring up her talk. And we're going to focus now on a very different part of the world in Southeast Australia and looking at bark traits.
All right. Thanks. That was a great series of talks. This is an awesome session. So I'm Kate Fuller, and I'm coming from Apache and Comanche country. This is the first chapter of my PhD, and there's been a lot of groups that have helped me along. So the Western Sydney University Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment and Bushfire Risk Management Research Hub funded my PhD. I've used NCAR supercomputing resources for this chapter, and I've also been housed at 2 separate universities because of COVID. So right now I'm at Texas Tech University. I'm focusing on eucalypts in New South Wales, excuse me, Australia. They they took over the landscape in Australia when the continent was aridifying and becoming more flammable, which means that they evolved these really unique fire resistant traits that allow them to survive pretty severe fires and also promote fire on the landscape in order to wage war against the ancestral rainforests that occurred there before they radiated on the landscape. So now they're the dominant species in the majority of forest types in New South Wales. And one of the key traits that they have is these epicormic resprouts that can occur anywhere within the outer and inner bark. They run the length of the bark instead of having buds closer to the surface. So that's a real protective advantage in extreme fires. Bark types also contribute differently to fire behavior. The ribbony and stringy barks in particular form fire ladders that increase risk of crown fires through vertical fuel continuity. They're highly flammable, especially the stringy barks. And this is thought to possibly be a pyrogenic strategy, although it hasn't been demonstrated, and it's pretty controversial in the literature. Ribbony and stringy barks also form firebrands, and this is pretty unprecedented outside the eucalypts in terms of the number of firebrands, the quantity of firebrands, and the distance also. So these firebrands are lofted, they're embers that are lofted ahead of the fire front, and the ribbon barks, which the ribbony, when I describe ribbony, I mean the long strings of bark that are depicted in this image here, can be thrown as far as 30 kilometers ahead of the fires. That's actually been confirmed. And these may be incendiary devices for waging war against the rainforest and taking over new territory. But again, controversial in the literature. That these bark fuels are not well integrated into fuels management. They're wrapped up into the overall fuel load of a site rather than being incorporated in their own unique way of affecting fire behavior. Bark is important for a lot of things. It's been focused on in fire behavior, fire resistance traits and life history strategies, but they coordinate with a lot of other important plant traits. So they are good indicators of some life history strategies. They're affected by different environmental pressures. And part of the confusion in the literature is that the roles of inner and outer bark differ, and this hasn't always been acknowledged, partly because it's much easier to measure overall bark thickness. But it's important to differentiate. So the outer bark, it is primarily protective against fluctuations in temperature, including heat damage from fire. And the outer bark thickness is strongly correlated with fire frequency. This may be related to moisture content or bark density because they are all correlated, but it hasn't been differentiated, and bark thickness is more commonly measured. Inner bark stores and translocates the photosynthate and water, which may help buffer against fluctuations in daily and seasonal water availability. It also houses the photosynthetic tissues. This is supposed to be a study on bark fuels, but it just I went down a rabbit hole with this, so you'll have to indulge me with some of these bark anatomy things. It is important for the questions. So because of the relationship between inner and outer bark and the different roles, some of the textures that we observe can be indicators of life history strategies. So smooth bark tends to mean thin outer bark. And the reason for this is smooth bark is formed by shedding these outer layers, which inherently means the outer bark is thinner compared to a rough bark tree just generally. So a lot of trees do this. The gum barks do this, and sycamores, London plane trees do this, birches, and then beech trees also. I had to look this up because I was like, what about beech trees? So they actually do shed their bark, but in really small flakes. They're really slow growing trees, and so you don't typically observe it. So it's really small pieces over long periods of time. Trees do this because they have this photosynthetic layer in the inner bark, which if you have too much outer bark, prevents light penetration to these inner layers. And it's really efficient in terms of water use and also in hot conditions. There's lots of reasons for this, but I won't go into it. It's basically beneficial in hot, dry conditions, it's thought. So in eucalypts in particular, because of these resprouts they have in the inner bark, could be really helpful for providing locally available carbohydrates. This photosynthesis that occurs in the stem it doesn't rely on hydraulic function, excuse me, which means that it can still provide carbon resources after all the leaves have been lost. And so it may aid in this epicormic resprouting, which eucalypts are really known for, which helps them take over the vacuum that's caused by crown damage after fire. More texture, conversely, compared to smooth bark, really kind of means thicker, less dense bark, but it hasn't directly been studied. This is just sort of logical that the rough bark on the outside is caused by this pressure that's formed from the inner layers being laid down successively inside. So the bark grows from the inside, and then the pressure on the outside from successive layers being laid down causes fissures and rough textures. And so generally speaking, rough bark means thicker bark. And this would create better insulation against fire. Bark texture is the trait that I focused on for the study, mostly because it's convenient, it's frequently observed. It can also be classified at the species level in terms of eucalypts at least. And so it tends to be really convenient for categorizing species. And it also specifically describes outer bark, although with the relationship between inner and outer bark, there are some general trends we can observe just from the texture on the outside, like smooth bark being thin, outer bark, probably low protection from fire. So I categorized the species into 10 categories of texture and 2 ribboning categories because they overlap, and then modeled them to identify possible divergent fire and ecological strategies, although it is a correlation study, just observational, so there's no mechanistic testing of this. It's a caveat limitation of the study. And then I've created maps of bark type distributions in order to help management possibly more integrate these bark fuels into stand management or hazard level assessment. And I've grouped them into general questions. I'll focus a little bit on the smooth with stalking and half bark. So smooth bark indicates like all over smooth. Smooth with stalking is like this stalk at the base of the tree, little rough bark at the base, which might give you some protection from surface fires. And then the half barks are rough bark halfway up the stem and smooth bark above. And then some other groupings just based on descriptions, bark descriptions, and then the ribboning categories. And these were all modeled separately and then compared. The species records came from Bionet vegetation surveys, and then I categorized the species by bark type based on species descriptions from any resources I could find, and then used environmental covariates to model them on the landscape. And there were 79 environmental variables accounting for climate, soil topography, and NDVI, which were largely remotely sensed data sets. And then I took the first 6 axes and fire history and used them as predictors in random forest models. And I used the first 6 axes, which are actually quite a gradual decrease in the explained variance of the PC axes. Usually you see a much stronger drop off, but it seemed like there was some variation that was getting accounted for in the later axes. And so I used these as well as predictors. And then I used a fire only model as well. So the fire history as the only predictor in the models in order to directly test how predictable these bark type distributions were just from fire. What I found was that productivity, the productivity axis, was important in all models, which is unsurprising. And fire did not contribute greatly to any of the full variable models, although it did have notable contributions to the subfibrous peppermint ribboning. So the more ribboning species rather than sometimes ribboning or short ribbons being formed, the ribboning categories, those really long distance and prolific ribbons, and the subfibrous tessellated models. And then even though fire didn't contribute greatly to a lot of them, I'm not ruling it out as a driving force. I think it's still important. Part of the reason I think it didn't have a lot of good explanatory power was that it's correlated with many of the environmental variables. And with random forest models, the correlation between variables can affect importance metrics. And it's also not a strong data set for explaining fire regime because it doesn't incorporate fire severity or seasonality. And lastly, fire history is really variable in New South Wales. Fire occurrence is variable. So 50 years of data was all I used in order to limit the spatial inaccuracies from before 1970. But not only is fire variable, it's also probably not representative of fire regimes in the state going back later than 50 years. Last 50 years, we've seen a big change in fire regimes in New South Wales. And so when the forests were established, even most of these trees were established, probably differed in terms of fire regime than the last 50 years. So I'm not ruling it out. And I also did find that the fire only models, even given all these caveats, had some highly predictive models up to 70% accuracy, especially for the ribboning and subfibrous peppermint models. These are my bark prediction maps, which are really pretty. And there's so much information in them that I can't cover all of the results, but I did find that the bark types were highly predictable, up to 87.3% balanced accuracy. And the bark types differed in their relationships to environmental variables, which does support the idea that these bark type groupings are indicators of ecological strategies. The bark types themselves may not directly be driving the distributions of these species on the landscape, because they are probably correlated with lots of other traits, but it's a useful indicator of these patterns that we're seeing from the models. Looking at the observed presence versus absence data, I did find that the distributions of smooth stalking, and half barks in terms of their relationship to environmental variables and also where they were predicted based on the models followed the current theories regarding the balance between fire protection and stem photosynthetic capacity. So this was really encouraging. I found that the distribution of subfibrous peppermint species was the most likely to occur in the more frequently burned areas of 3 or more fires, which may, because it's rough barked and not smooth barked, it's not trading off in favor of photosynthetic capacity, which means it is growing bark in order to protect the stem from something. But because it's occurring in the more fire-prone habitat, this may be an indication of a fire-tolerant strategy. Subfibrous box species are also rough barked and occurred most strongly in places where fires were not present at all. And they also occur, this is a prediction map, most frequently in the really dry regions of the state where there was low fire frequency. And it may indicate fire avoidance strategy, but I also suspect because rough bark can protect against all kinds of temperature fluctuation damage, it may be heat stress that it's protecting against because these are also very hot environments. All right, so I just want to thank everybody who helped me, my supervisors in particular, fantastic collaborators to work with. And I have so many people to thank for talking to me about this, including some relatives over Thanksgiving, who I did not mention on the slide. But I also want to shout out the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange paid for my registration for the conference so that I could present on the virtual lab for students, which connects people virtually, which was really great during COVID to have some people to chat with. A lot of these people are part of the NATC virtual lab. If you're interested, please check out my poster, and also you can email this email address to get on the list. So thank you.
Okay, folks, do we have any questions for Kathryn? I just check one other place, Kathryn, and I have some questions for you.
Okay.
Okay. In terms of fire, you said you used just fire alone to test the model. How were your fire records developed, and do you think that there's more detail that can go into that part of the modeling?
Yeah, these were data collected by the Rural Fire Service, I think from polygons, line scans from fires, but going back to 1970, they probably weren't even that. They're probably pretty coarse in terms of specificity on the landscape. The more recent burns are very well resolved, and a lot of work has gone into making those high resolution. But yeah, going even to 1970 is a bit of a stretch in terms of the spatial accuracy. So there's a lot of work that could be done towards building a better fire regime data set, and there have been some publications, but they've been Australia-wide, and so at the state level, there's not quite enough resolution to use those in an analysis. Yeah, it's a whole, I think it could be a whole postdoc. If anybody's hiring, you can take me on. I'm happy to build one.
And in terms of characterizing bark traits, my impression is that there's been a lot more attention paid in Australia because of the large spread via firebrands than there has in other parts of the world. But having also lived in other places in North America, do you see opportunities to do research in those, for future research in those areas?
Yeah, absolutely. The virtual lab actually did 2 separate sessions on firebrands and then another one on fire and bark. It's a huge area of research that people are really working on. There's some people working on it in Florida. The firebrands are caused by all kinds of material, including from the crown as well. But in terms of bark firebrands, there are some people in New Jersey working on pine flakes, the flaky material off of pine in these really flammable New Jersey pine bearing ecosystems, where this is a significant problem on the ground for fire managers. But being a bark person, it's easy for me to focus on that, but it is important to note that firebrands can be caused by all kinds of material in the ground. So there's people working on the physics of this all over the world.
Okay, I'm going to just double check the question and answer poll one more time. Okay, and then one final question for you before we transfer over about bark. Do you have any information on how those bark traits, in addition to bark thickness, which is what we primarily use in North America for modeling, relate to heat transfer into the inner bark?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's been very poorly studied, if I'm being honest. There's a handful of studies. The methods haven't been well defined. Some use direct flame, others use ambient heat. I know of a study that's going to be coming out soon by a student at University of Melbourne on eucalypts. Otherwise, there's really just a handful of them. Yeah, it's an area of research that needs to be looked into more closely. And I think also now that we know that there's really significant differences between inner and outer bark, quantifying the outer bark thickness, density, soil moisture content, and then testing insulation capacity, comparing it to inner bark thickness and those same qualities, I think is a really important question.
Excellent. Kathryn, thank you so much for your time. We're going to switch to our next speaker, which is Nuria Sánchez López, who's going to be speaking to us about fuels in pine forests in the southeastern US. Oh, we can't hear you.
Okay, now.
Yep, and you're good to go now. We're right on the hour.
Okay, so thank you. My name is Nuria. I am going to explain you some of the work that we are doing to map litter accumulation in pine forests in the southeastern US by merging some remote sensing data with traditional ecological modeling. And plant litter is one of the biggest input for surface fuels, so it's really important to know how much we have, but also how it is distributed over the forest floor, right? For fire, dry fire spread and consumption, and at the end, it's like really important for improving our modeling approaches. Current methods are a little bit limited because many times they relied on data sample on the field, which introduce large uncertainties because there is large variability over the forest floor. So if we don't capture all of that, at the end, our models might be a little bit limited, and the transferability might be also a problem. Then if we use remote sensing techniques and data sets that are really good for wall-to-wall mapping forest attributes of the canopy, the sensitivity of both active and passive sensors become really limited under the canopy forest. So we need to develop new approaches that allowed us to resolve that issue and that give us the opportunity to map litter accumulation over relatively large areas for what we need. So if we look a little bit to the accumulation process, especially in those sites that we are focusing in the southeastern US that are under prescribed management, we see that there is three main processes that drive the accumulation. One is the fire, when and how it happened, the litter production that it might be dependent on climate, but is especially driven by above ground biomass and species characteristics. And based on that, we will see like patterns of accumulation. And for instance, under the crowns of the trees and near them, there will be larger accumulations than in open areas and gaps. And the last, the other process that influences the accumulation is the decomposition that is mainly driven by litter quality, decomposers, and climate. And it's a really important also parameter over the long term. So if in the absence of like another fire in between, like it will be a moment like the composition and the litter for production will reach a steady state of accumulation. And this is actually some of the basis that has been used for in traditional ecological models, like this Olson equation, that it was proposed in the 60s, and it has been widely used by fire ecologists at the landscape and the stand level, because provides a realistic way to model the accumulation. It is actually a negative exponential equation that is defined by the three parameters that I was just talking before: the time since fire, the decomposition, and a steady annual accumulation rate that can be linked to the litter fall. Some authors have even proposed a modification to assume a non-zero condition so that we don't assume that all the litter after a fire it was removed from the forest floor. The problem of these models are simplistic, as I said. They do assumptions like the decomposition and the deposition are steady over time, which in reality is a complex process. But in the overall picture, it provides a useful tool that is also really easy to apply. The problem is mainly that it's difficult to use this model in a spatially explicit way, because it's difficult to get this information at high spatial resolution. And this is where we can actually use some remote sensing data set, because actually remote sensing and especially LiDAR data is really sensitive to the 3D structure of the forest canopy. And especially in forested sites where the litter fall is mainly driven by the tree cover, we can relate litter fall rates to the above ground biomass. So this is what we're trying to do in this modeling approach, is like use the Olson equation in a spatially explicit way by introducing a spatially explicit maps of litter fall And to obtain that, we are proposing to develop a top-down approach in which we use LiDAR data to identify where the trees are located. And then from that, we obtain the annual litter-fall rates, and knowing the time since fire in the different stands, because managers in those sites, they maintain updated records. We can also, with some data of the composition, we can estimate accumulation in a spatially explicit way. So some of the analysis that I am going to show you are located in Eglin Air Force Base that is in Florida. We have other sites, but this is probably the best at the moment because we have the time since fire records, the airborne LiDAR data, and some inventory data to develop the analysis, but also some field litter samples that they were collected from previous projects from which we know the time since fire, so we can have a guess of if this methodology is going in the right direction to gather the litter accumulation variability over the forest floor or not. So those sites are mainly dominated by longleaf pine forests, sometimes accompanied by some deciduous trees like some Turkey oaks. So going a little bit to the methodology, that is probably the core part of this modeling approach, is to obtain the litter fall maps. So it's first what we do is like obtain the tree crowns from the airborne LiDAR. So using a canopy height model and different segmentation techniques to identify the crowns of the different trees that we have over the study sites. We obtain the data polygons, and also we compute different attributes from the crowns, like the crown base height or the projected area, the volume, etc. And then from this, we go to compute, to estimate litter fall from foliage biomass. And then when we have our estimates at the tree crown level, we disperse that, we rasterize and we disperse that litter over the study sites. How do we estimate litter fall? In this case, we are using a predictive approach based on a random forest model. So we have some data from the field where we know the tree locations. We also know the attributes like the DBH and the height. And based on that, we can compute the foliage biomass for each of the trees. We relate that to our segmentation and to train a random forest model in which the predictive, the dependent variables are the crown variables, and in the response is the foliage biomass. So once we have the foliage biomass at the tree level, what we get is the litter fall, and for this step, what we are using is a biomass abundance approach that it has been used in some carbon models and in some inventory studies where they compute from foliage biomass litter fall. That is basically assume that a percentage of the foliage biomass is going to fall each year, depending on the type of vegetation. So, for instance, for deciduous trees, the rate of annually would be 1, which in conifer that it might have the least 2 years, so it will be like 0.5. In this case, I am using average leaf turnover ratios because at the moment we didn't classify the crowns between deciduous and evergreen to apply specific leaf turnover ratios for each of them. So it's based on the inventory data that we have and the proportion that we expect of each species. But eventually it will be, probably we will improve this by classifying the crowns with some optical data, probably of high resolution. Well, when we have that, what we do is rasterize, and we disperse a little bit the litter among the neighboring areas by trying to mimic some of the influence that the litter might have on based on topography or wind. So, but we are just applying here a convolutional filter, a focal function, where we just apply a 3x3 kernel size, and we redistribute the litter over the neighboring pixels. So when we will finish all of this process, what we have here is exactly this input, the annual liter for accumulation that we can use for within the ozone equation. At the moment, for the modeling approach, we are using time since fire records from the managers. The decomposition rate has been set for this specific site at Eglin from literature. Other studies that have been performed with similar kind of vegetation and climate. So we have looked at that, but this is one of the parameters that we need to calibrate better in the future work. And we are also assuming a non-zero condition after the previous fire because we have samples, litter field samples, and we know that not all the litter is removed. So based on that, we have added an average value. So getting on some preliminary results of some estimates that we are doing. So after we all those processing of the tree crowns and we compute the foliage biomass, we estimate the litter for, and for instance, this is the L2F unit in Eglin, where the average litter for will be around like 160 grams per meter square a year. But we see that the patterns are really variable depending on where we have like more like abundant biomass based on the trees, based on the characteristics of the crowns, etc. So when we compute the accumulation after 3 years, and here is 3 years because I am also comparing with some clip plots of litter that were collected in the field after 3 years since fire. So we see the same patterns that are driven by the litter fall, more or less, and it will be an accumulation of 0.4 kilograms per meter square of the overall unit. The average is a little bit higher for the clip plots, but I mean, we have part of the unit that is not sampled. And when we compare specifically the matching pixels with the litter clip plots, we see that there is more or less a relatively good correlation, what gives us a hint that we are probably capturing well the variability that we see on the accumulation. This is for a sample size of 65 litter plots. I have compared to other sites also at Eglin where we have another samples, normally is less than in this case. So I have defined some regions of interest to compare if like the average values are getting in like more or less in the same levels. For instance, this is like 0.29 on the litter clip plots in the 20 average observation, and we are predicting 0.33. This is another case. We get sometimes closer, sometimes a little bit, there is more biased. And the one-to-one relationship between the specific pixels and the field litter clip location is around an RS correlation of 0.69 and more or less in the same degree that we were seeing before. So this is a work in progress. So we are still working on developing the methods so we can better estimate the litter for accumulation. But overall, we see a good performance on the spatial representativity of the litter accumulation. So basically, where we see more accumulation on the field is where we are predicting more, and more or less we are in the one-to-one degree of like that we are getting to the right mark. The decomposition rate is something that we need to work better because we know that this is a tricky parameter, and especially after a few years since fire. Until now, I was comparing to 1, 2, 3 years since fire, which is relatively close. But when we go to 6, 7, the ground decomposition will give us larger bias in the accumulation. So probably we need to look to areas that they didn't burn in a long time to understand what is the steady state of accumulation, and from then trying to infer a better decomposition and relate that probably to litter quality based on species characteristics. We are trying to improve our validation datasets because at the end, at the moment, what I am using is data that it was collected for other projects. So it's not especially sample in different times since fire, not for complete units. So it's difficult to have a good data set in this regard, but we are trying to improve it by collecting data on other site places where we might find also LiDAR and time since fire record, so we can actually develop the same approach and see if like the transferability of the model is good or not. And just in the same line, we are in doing analysis similar to this in other sites of the Southeastern US, like Pebble Hill, Fort Jackson, and so on, and with the intention to extend the analysis there. And well, just with that, I will say thank you, especially to all the people that has at some point given me any feedback or data, or is still on the process to do that. And if you have any question or any complaint, concern, I will be glad to answer all of them. So.
Thank you, Nuria. That was an excellent presentation. Let's see if we have any questions from our audience. I'm going to just check the Q&A here. We have a question. Have you observed any differences in wetter versus drier years with topographic wetness?
Well, that's one of the things at the moment. We are not using, we are kind of getting a liter fall annual rate that is not dependent on climate, it's dependent on the biomass. So technically, I haven't compared to different years of liter fall in order to see, obviously there will be like differences. And this is one of the main points that I was saying at the beginning, that we are assuming that the liter fall rate is steady over time, which is actually not. So probably in the future, we'll need to start to gather in, like in years where the climate is more aggressive than other, assume that there is a percentage more of liter fall than other, and calibrate yearly by yearly. But at the moment, we are just getting the average values.
Is the assumption about liter fall and decomposition that time since fire is a linear relationship, or could those have more complicated interactions with time since fire?
Well, we are like using the also an equation that is assuming that there is a negative exponential. So basically, no, it's not linear, but there is a moment where the composition and the liter fall kind of balance. So we are using the remote sensing to get the liter fall, and after we model that through time based on those parameters.
Excellent. I have another question for you in terms of how you went from how and use of allometric equations versus use of LiDAR point returns within the tree segmentation. And so you used allometric equations to get the canopy litter surface, but was there other data about the LiDAR derived segmented trees that you also used to get the crown foliage estimates?
So what we did is like calibrate the model. Basically, the allometric equation, we use them for compute the foliage biomass at the tree level on the ones that we like stem map in the field. We estimate the foliage biomass there, and this is our ground truth in the model. And then we model that, like we train the model using from the matching crowns, the different attributes that we have computed from the segmentation, that it can be the height of there is a set of variables, like the tree crown base, the density of points, the height, the volume. So all of these go in the random forest, and those are the predictive that we use in order to calibrate the model.
Excellent. Okay, I understand better now. Thank you.
Yes.
Let me just double check if there's any other questions from our group. Checking two places. We don't have any additional questions or follow-up. If anyone in the audience feels like unmuting their mic and asking them, you can go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next speaker. And we're just going to give it a couple minutes until we're 1 minute until we're right at 10:20 before Rodrigo Leite's pre-recorded presentation is started. Excellent. And this is going to be our final presentation for this section of the special session, and we will hopefully see you guys back after the break. Okay, go ahead.
Hello everyone, I'm Rodrigo. I'm a PhD student in Brazil, and I'm going to present today this project which I'm working as part of my PhD, where we're trying to estimate fuel load in multiple vegetation layers using JEDI data. JEDI is the NASA Spaceport LiDAR system, which was designed specifically to map Earth's vegetation, and we're trying to bring that for a fire management perspective. I'm actually representing here many contributors, those in this list and many others that are part of the Fuego project, which I'll tell a little bit about at the end of my presentation. I want to highlight here that I'm going to present is a summary of our results that we recently published in Remote Sensing of Environment, and more details on our methods, results, discussion, and everything can be found in more detail in this paper. But I'll try to bring a big picture and a summary of everything. I'm gonna follow this framework, just giving a brief introduction, just to contextualize our project, and then showing our methods and results, and some final remarks on our next steps on our project, and a little bit of the Fuego project too. So just a step back here for recalling the importance of fuel loads. We know that fuels are the vegetation biomass that is available for burning in a wildfire, and there might be a big difference on fire severity and fire behavior, fire spread rate, depending on how fuels are available and how fuels manage to. And at the end, we need the accurate estimations of fuel load to implement all those fire management practices. Remote sensing has been used for mapping fuel loads and estimate fuel loads, especially using LiDAR. We know that with LiDAR we can get those amazing 3D information from several vegetation layers, and all those layers are important on fire management, and that can help on planning our fire activities. But most of those sensors that are used, that are mostly airborne and terrestrial sensors, may have an issue when we need to cover large areas. LiDAR can be used in many platforms, and terrestrial and airborne, that are usually the most common ones, are limited to those local assessments. And satellite, we didn't have much satellite data, and until recently, at least not specifically designed for mapping vegetation. And in 2018, the JEDI, the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation, was launched, and it expected that more than 10 billion cloud-free waveform observations from Earth's land surface from about 52 degrees north and south will be collected, and to map Earth's vegetation is the first spaceborne LiDAR system for that purpose. Here's a more detailed way of how JEDI works. It's on the International Space Station. It's a LiDAR system, and it has 3 near-infrared lasers that shoots down, that are split into 8 beams, and it maps Earth's land in 8 ground tracks covering about a 4.2 kilometer swath. Each of those beams illuminates a 25 diameter circle, and from that footprint, it gets all its data. Is basically all the energy of those beams are returned are recorded as a function of time, and from that you can get the object's location. And here, like in this example, the first returns are going to be from top of the canopy, last returns from surface, and you can also get from subtraction between them for example, total canopy height. So JEDI is the first spaceborne LiDAR designed for mapping Earth vegetation, and we wanted to assess if it can be used for mapping fuel loads as well. And that brings us to our objective, where we try to assess the potential of JEDI to predict fuel load. And we try to integrate JEDI data with field data and random forest algorithm to achieve this goal. I'm going to give an overview of our methods and then going to go in detail of each part. It's basically divided into 3 parts, where we first surveyed our area with a UAV LiDAR system, getting discrete return point clouds, and from them we simulated JEDI full waveforms. So we went to the field, collected data in several vegetation layers and several savanna and forest ecosystems, and used them together to train a random forest algorithm. With this algorithm, we applied it to the footprints of our study region and derived our fuel load maps. So just giving also an overview of our study region, is located in the Brazilian tropical savanna, also known as Cerrado, is a savanna biome that accounts for more than 20% of Brazil land area, which is about 200 million hectares, and is the second largest biome in Brazil, only behind the Amazon, and is important for is a hotspot of biodiversity, and with more than 10,000 plant species, from which more than 4,000 are endemic, and it's also characterized by a range of vegetation structures. Fire is a really important element there, and since human occupation started in agriculture, and with agricultural expansion, human activities have changed fire regime. In some areas, the fire has been totally suppressed, and it led to loss of biodiversity. In other areas, fire affected. Big fires have threatened also forest ecosystems, so fire regime has been really changed and needs to be managed. We collected over 400 sites in Cerrado, and trying to cover all the vegetation structures from grasslands to forests. Here are some pictures of the study sites, and shows a little bit of the diverse vegetation structures we can get in Cerrado, from grasslands to dense forests. So in these sites, we laid out 50 sample plots with 30 by 30 meters, and we measured all trees with DBH greater than 10 centimeters, and in subplots we measured small trees and shrubs with DBH lower than 10 centimeters, and also collected all the surface litter, herbs, and wood debris in another subplots, and calculated their biomass to be used as dependent variables in our models, and separated them into different models. Here's our hardworking team collecting surface data and sampling our sample plots in the different Cerrado vegetation types. So also in these plots, we surveyed with a UAV LiDAR system, the Gatoreye, which is a DJI matrix hexacopter with a Velodyne ultrapulse sensor coupled in it. And in our site, it yielded a point cloud with about 450 points per square meter. And it is managed by Dr. Broadband, and more details on this sensor and on this system can be found on the Spec Lab website, which also has lots of data for working with LiDAR. So from those high density point clouds, we simulated JEDI data, which basically means that with our discrete return point clouds, we converted them to full waveform signals and added the expected JEDI noise. It's basically how the simulation works. It was published by Dr. Hancock and team, and all the details and technical details of the simulation can be found in this paper. But it's basically based on this conversion and noise, adding this expected noise. This was conducted using the RJEDI package, which is our tool for working with the JEDI, and there's lots of tools there to working with JEDI. And So from the simulated waveforms, we calculated metrics that relates to vegetation structure to be used in our models. Basically, all those metrics are used in several studies that try to estimate biomass or biodiversity, and they all relate to the vegetation height or vegetation cover, and they were used as independent variables in our models. We used as our modeling approach the algorithm of random forest and assessed it using conventional statistical accuracy assessment such as coefficient of determination, root mean square error, and mean difference. So for the JEDI data, the JEDI already provides many products, and we know that it's all those 25 diameter circles, and the data we get is full waveforms, and JEDI already provides not only the full waveforms, but also the relative metrics, the relative height metrics, and canopy cover and vertical profile metrics. So we downloaded them to apply our models. So we finally applied our models to all those data over Cerrado to get our fuel load maps. As JEDI is a sampling mission, we aggregated all those footprints into 1 kilometer cells to generate a map. So the first result I'm going to present here is this difference between JEDI full waveform signals and discrete return LiDAR in the different vegetation types. We can see that in dense forests, much of the returns are staying in this first signal, and when vegetation is too low, the ground and vegetation signals are mixed into a single signal. This difficults a lot modeling for low vegetation, and this is important because we are really interested in this low stratum vegetation, and also Cerrado is mostly composed by short vegetation too. We can see that also in our metrics that had increasing values from grasslands to forests, with especially in the relative height and canopy cover fraction. So in our model performance for surface and herbaceous, we had a R2 of about 0.8. This is our training results, and RMC of about 2 megagrams per hectare. We had better results with woody and total fuels, where R2 was about 0.97 and total about 0.92. But it's from our training results. In our validation, the results dropped a little, but we also had our best results for predicting woody fuels, which is a kind of expected, since most of the energy may stay on the first canopy and in the top of the canopy. And maybe for the lower accuracy for surface and herbaceous fuels are limited because, as we show in our previous slides, the energy can be mixed with ground and maybe not be enough to interact with this short vegetation. And maybe this explanation power that we had for those surface and herbaceous fuels are related to more indirect relationships, since like in forests we had much lower values of herbaceous fuels. This is to show the level of detail we can get with JEDI. We can get now our estimates for 25 meter diameter circles, right? And for that we can get also the top of the canopy and ground, so we can assess how our fields are distributed. And of course this is for the whole entire Cerrado area, which is 200 million hectares. So now we could derive our fuel load maps, where it can hopefully be used for other fire management and planning activities. There we can spot like areas with lower fuel values and areas of fuel accumulation, and hopefully this can be used for fire behavior modeling and for planning all the fuel load management activities. We also observed in the histograms that we observed higher frequencies of lower values, and this is probably because Cerrado is mostly composed of savanna vegetation types. We also observed now more of the JEDI part of the interpretation of our results, that JEDI footprint density varies a lot depending on the area, because it's dependent on the International Space Station orbit, right? And so areas with few footprints and there was areas with over 100 footprints. That can have an impact on the uncertainty of our predictions, especially if the vegetation is too diverse in some areas. We mapped that and we got that the number of footprints affects a little the uncertainty of our estimates, and we gonna get at some point here a kind of an ideal number that needs to be explored, because it depends on lots of things. So for our conclusions, we have that fuel load in different layers can be predicted with JEDI data, and JEDI is very efficient to depict vegetation structure, Cerrado vegetation types. Short and surface vegetation is harder to obtain, and especially directly, because the interaction and the beam energy can be not enough to interact with those vegetations, but the indirect relationships can give some insights and some power of explanation in our models. So for our next steps, we want to calculate uncertainty and map this uncertainty and evaluate what is causing the uncertainty besides the footprint density on those cells. And we also want to improve predictions for wall-to-wall 30-meter cells that will hopefully be useful for fuel load management and fire behavior modeling, and understand the fuel load dynamics in Cerrado. Just bringing again that more detail can be found on this manuscript. Feel free to get in touch for giving any feedback or give any discussion, and that is very helpful every time. And just as final remarks here, I want to highlight this is part of a bigger project in Brazil that's trying to integrate several remote sensors to improve fire management in Cerrado, and also counts with participation from many institutions and many people, many contributors, and is led by Professor Kathryn Fuller and Professor Dr. Carlos Silva, which I also thank for the opportunity on helping on this project. And also to this stellar team that has been working hard in every step of the project, from field collection and data processing and everything. Also to sponsors that made my attendance possible to this event. And thank you for your attention, and hope I can meet with you guys in the next meeting in another time soon. Thanks.
Hi, folks. That is our last presentation before the break. Rodrigo, you are here in the audience. Do you want to try to take any questions or provide any additional summary live?
Yes, thanks, Dr. Cansler. I'm here, and well, if there is any question, any feedback, and any discussion point, I'm open to hear. And
yeah, I'll just start off by saying the challenge of trying to get at what is on the ground or in the lower strata from any of these airborne platforms that I'm used to using and have been using recently is really challenging. And I think you really showed clearly that the spaceborne platforms have that challenge to a greater extent. For your ecosystems that you're working in, how much does that surface vegetation and fuel layer really drive the observed fire behavior and fire regime?
Yes, so it's really important, and because basically it works the same of other savanna ecosystems, and when it's pretty much drives all the fire behavior and fire spread rate. But what happens here in Cerrado is that fire suppression has been the main kind of fire policy in many types. So we're kind of losing also the biodiversity that we have on those lower fuel layers. So it's important in kind of two ways: one for the fire spread rate, another for the kind of biodiversity loss that we're having since fire is being suppressed in many areas. So it's kind of a whole thing that goes in kind of two ways.
What height, sorry to jump in, what height does it become a problem differentiating surface and ground?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. And we actually don't know for sure. Jedi was supposed to have like a pretty good vertical accuracy, but maybe we need more plots to know that for sure, I think, because at some point there's, like I said, at some point we will have the power to split from the canopy layers and kind of lower stratum, but I don't have a kind of a number for that, and it's pretty much one good point, really good point to look more into.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Excellent. I think Anthony may cut us off here and tell us that it's time for break. So hopefully we can continue these conversations about the limitations from all these platforms and data sources in our discussion section at the end of the last block of talks coming up. Rodrigo, we really appreciate your contribution, both to learn about a different ecosystem and a different set of data.
Thank you. Thank you for.
All right, everyone. Well, I want to first start off by thanking all of our speakers for sharing your expertise and your voice with us. We really do appreciate it. This session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. Up next, we have a little under a 20-minute break before our next round of breakout sessions begin. Choose from our second virtual field trip, 5 special sessions, and 1 general session. To choose the one you'd like to join, use the agenda tab to the left of your screen, click sessions, and click the main session title to join. To join the session offering Spanish and Portuguese interpretation, be sure to select the session titled Ecosystem Services. Thank you again to our speakers, and we will see you all soon. Bye-bye.